If there's one thing to know about Fire Emblem Heroes is that no matter what, if something is already really good in the game, chances are they'll release something that's an even better version of that down the line. Unless you're Broadcatria, whether that's a year from now, several years from now, could even be a month, a week, depending on whatever the skill or unit is, eventually it will be aged up or power crept. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing because you could still use X unit even if it's just slightly weaker than the newer thing. But what about the units that didn't really have that chance to really get going? This is units and skills that aged too fast. I do want to make some ground rules real quick before we get into this. First off, I'm not going to be covering any generic whatsoever, and by generics I mean units that don't come with a PRF and only have their stats and weapon and archetype to go off of. So for example, I'm not going to talk about the Ninja Hana, Ninja Shamir thing because that's just more stats versus old stats. Moreover, I don't want to necessarily talk about something that will inevitably get power crept or already has, but rather focus on the skills and units that really didn't have any time to shine, whether because they got new tools to focus on or some new inheritable came out that made it obsolete. Something that was just so fast into the game where they just had no time to shine whatsoever. And in a similar vein, a definitive reason to use one unit over another. Not necessarily because one unit is necessarily just a bit better, but just because they're a complete upgrade and they really just had, again, no real reason to ever be around. For example, Owen and Reinhardt. I think this goes without saying for a lot of veteran players, but this is probably one of the easiest comparisons that could come to mind. Owen and Reinhardt share PRF, a same archetype, same everything. The biggest difference is that Owen was a 5-star locked unit and Reinhardt is a demote, which means that one was inevitably easier to merge. I think the biggest issue here though is that Reinhardt just had a much better stat line and still arguably does to this day, even though both of them have significantly fallen off. The biggest thing for both of them is that they had a player phase Brave Magic Tome, which only means that you really need attack for the most part, especially since neither of them were able to really take advantage of most of their other stats. You could take advantage of Owen's speed to an extent, but the problem was that she just never hit hard by any means because she had really low attack. And with how new skills are nowadays and stat creep and all that, that low attack back then is definitely a lot lower nowadays. Even though she has access to a lot more tools at her disposal, she could easily miss a lot of kills because of the fact that she lacks attack. I wouldn't say Reinhardt is in the best position either, but at the same time he's a demote, so you could justify it a bit more. The ones you can't really justify are the ones that are extremely 5-star locked, including Fallen Ike and Sayri, who I wouldn't say are completely comparable because, you know, this is quotation marks comparable. Fallen Ike has a Spectrum Unity distant counter weapon, which means you can stack sets to Oblivion, and Sayri has a conditional distant counter weapon with Slaying, which, you know, there's definitely something there you could maybe do. I don't really think so, but it's definitely a weapon. I think the biggest slap in the face with this especially is that Sayri came out after Fallen Ike, and this wasn't even like a year apart or like several months apart. I'm fairly certain this was only a month or two apart, which means you had almost no reason to use somebody like Sayri, especially since Fallen Ike was incredibly good at the time. They're both due for refines in the future, but as it currently stands, she really is just Kestrel Stance 3 and Close Call 3 pre-fodder. You can still make use of the weapon, but she has relatively low bulk for any sort of distant counter shenanigans, so I don't really recommend it. What I also don't recommend is going for Diamant over Brave Robin, who is entirely free. Diamant is not a bad unit by any means, and I want to make that perfectly clear. He has null DR, he has true damage reduction. I think his biggest issue is that he cannot tank for the life of him. He's a really good tank buster, but he's also a melee infantry, which means that's also limited in scope. Brave Robin can pretty much do everything Diamant can, but offer more in return as well because of Rally Spectrum and Tip the Scales. If you're worried about the range portion of it, Robin could just warp to anybody who has Tip the Scales active, which is incredible, up to 5 spaces. They both nullify damage reduction. Robin is arguably a lot tankier because not only does he have speed, but also he has percent-based damage reduction, which Diamant cannot access. I'm still going to stand by the fact that true damage reduction by itself is not good comparatively to percent. I think what makes the effect really good is when combined with stuff that also grants percent-based damage reduction, but even that aside, there's really nothing that Diamant does over Brave Robin in particular. Even though I do think both of them are solid options, I do think it's another situation where after a month, there's just really no reason to use one over the other. But even then, we're at a point in the game where you can pretty much use anything for the most part and get away with it. I think that's one of the better benefits, and I did cover that in a previous video, but point being is that he didn't really have as much time to shine, and it's kind of sad because he is a really cool unit. Although in a similar fashion, we have Pluggy and Katarina and Male Morgan's Refine. Pluggy and Katarina, for those who don't know, also she got a plug-in weapon. Ooh, shocker, because that's from the theme. But she was a ranged flyer, and even at this time, she isn't exactly the most dominant unit. Male Morgan's refine soon followed, and he just became arguably a better Katarina because he was infantry. Very simple stuff for the most part, because turns out when you have access to really good skills and inheritables, you end up becoming a really solid unit. Although unfortunately some archetypes do hold back plenty of units, which does kind of suck. Even to this day, even if you can get away with a lot of stuff, some things are just way too dominant for some units to really take advantage of comparatively. The range flyer stuff aside, you also have green armors, which are very, very difficult to get going nowadays because of the post amount of red armor killers that we have in the game that are just everywhere. You know, Dual Crom, Legendary Hinoka. It doesn't even have to be a red armor killer. They could just be a very prominent nuke that we have in the game, and they could easily just shred through all sorts of green armors. But at that point, I think it's less about the armor itself and the fact that nukes are just incredibly overtuned at the moment. But you also have units that are incredibly dominant in an archetype, which means newer units that come out just aren't going to hold a candle to it. I think one of the more notable examples of that would be Brave Erica coming out and then Brave Eliwood getting his refine, which wasn't a bad refine by any means, but it was at that point where Brave Erica was just so good that you didn't really have any justifiable reason to use Eliwood over her. And then in a similar fashion with Brave Crom over Brave Erica, because he pretty much does everything she can do, but arguably better and offers more. It's just stuff like that that makes going into some archetypes super, super difficult for certain units, especially if they don't have anything going for them. Although outside the units that also just don't do anything different, you do have some units that introduce a new gimmick or effect that is really good on paper, but on the surface level, it's not really the best for them. And then they introduce it on another unit that just does it way better, you know, like Halloween Duma because he was an armor. And then they release the same unit again, but as an armor, and they're automatically way better. Also, Scowl as an inheritable, that's a really awesome skill. You know what also is a really awesome skill? Canto Control. That was a thing that was only limited to Makoto's refine prior to that becoming inheritable on Medius, and that didn't last all too long anyway. I do think if Canto Control wasn't an inheritable skill, we would definitely see a Makoto dominant meta, which is really funny to say, but obviously didn't happen because Canto Control released as a C slot, which means now everybody can run it, and it means Makoto herself really didn't do all too much in the grand scheme of things. Why run her over any other unit that can run Canto Control and offer even more stuff in the process? A lot of other units that don't tend to push the envelope also don't really gain any traction, and I think this also falls in line with a similar thing with stagnation and homogeny with the game, in that yes, the unit itself isn't bad by any means, but they don't do anything new or different from a lot of other units that we have in the game. So while in a theoretical sense they are good, it's just that they aren't compelling enough for everybody to start pulling and using. They aren't something that's pushing the meta in a way that makes it so you have to use them or use something to pass through that unit. And I think that's especially prominent this year more now than ever, which is why they've been pushing skills, but I digress. Skills also have their own issues when it comes to power creep as well. Holy Pressure, when that came out in February, was incredibly bad, and I still stand by that. It's incredibly bad, but because it was the first damaging healer special we had, it was something that everybody was going for just to give to their favorite healers. And then in a week, they came out with Light's Restraint, and it was just a bajillion million times better because it had 2 cooldown instead of 3 cooldown. Yeah, that was probably one of the biggest baited switches I've seen in a long time. And for anyone who pulled for Holy Pressure just to give to a unit they liked, and then Light's Restraint came out, and you're like, wow, that's so much better. I'm so sorry that you got baited. But don't worry, I've been baited in the past too. I got baited by Arena dual skills because I thought that would help me in a mode where scoring is just extremely bad at this point. Even before then, dual skills really weren't a remedy for most units outside of the ones that potentially had a pure FB slot, because at the time we didn't have 300 SP inheritable B slots, so they could still score relatively well. That being said, with how scoring is nowadays with duos and units hitting 200 BST naturally, they're very, very antiquated skills, and really the only reason you'd ever pull for an arena skill is because you like the unit for the most part. Some of them were able to score relatively well enough, but that was very few and far between anyway. But at least you had a purpose with those, unlike something like Brazen 4, Rouse 4, Stall Ploy, which in a theoretical sense weren't bad skills by any means, especially Stall Ploy. The problem is that for the time being, Brazen 4 and Rouse 4 did absolutely nothing until you had the prerequisites set up. And in Brazen's case, that you had to be below a certain amount of HP, which wasn't really worth it because you had to run a specific unit, and even then it was only stats. And in Rouse 4, you had to be solo, and in most maps you never start out solo, and it does limit your placement options very significantly. Meanwhile, stall ploy was just a ploy, and it's fine, but we had Reeve and Duo Thor, and it really just gained no value because most units didn't really need it, especially since it was HP based. Although for units that also had no shelf life, we could go to a whole different tangent with Elamine and any Anno Mythic not named Arvel. And this is before Freyr, because now Elamine is just completely dead in the water. Elamine, for who knows how long, I'm going to assume a year and a half, because I think that's how long it was, basically rendered every single Anima Mythic worthless. And this is by no means an exaggeration. All the Anima Mythics not named Arvel had no risk to compete with her whatsoever. Horribilis was a different case because she was a dancer and she didn't really have to worry about false start. But even that aside, a lot of the other ones like Duma, Lift, or Seer, even post remix and refine, could not do anything by any means. And while I wouldn't say they are exactly the best units nowadays, although I would say Thurseer is pretty decent, you could at least make a niche case use for somebody like Duma or Lift nowadays because Elamine no longer stops them. Prior to that though, you just plop one down and you render the entire enemy team completely kaputs. Very good game design, as you can clearly tell. Still, for what it's worth, I'm glad she's gone. I don't know about Freyr though, but I'm pretty sure people don't like Freyr, and I don't blame them for not liking Freyr. Sometimes I don't like him either. Still, I guess it could be worse because at least they have functioning refines. It's just that Elamine really stopped them. Units that had refines or got refines and then immediately had inheritables power creep it, that's probably the worst death sentence you could ever get. I think the biggest example of that of recent memory was definitely with Death Knight and Scythe of Serial with Arcane Chiang, where Scythe of Serial wasn't even a bad refine by any means, but it was also around the same time where we got the Arcane Chiang inheritable, which meant everybody can get a better version of that weapon. It was essentially a carbon copy of the same weapon, except instead of extra stats, it granted breath, so it was automatically better. And wow, I'm sorry for the Death Knight fans because that was a really big slap in the face, but you know what, it's a nice inheritable at least. It wasn't the only time something like that happened anyway. We also had Matthew with Spy's Dagger and Broadleaf Fan. I think this was probably another similar case to Makoto, where if this wasn't an inheritable, there would have probably been a time where Matthew was considered meta, which is also hilarious in hindsight, but Broadleaf was just a complete upgrade from Spy's Dagger. Both of them did have the same effect, but the big key difference is that Broadleaf ended up doing more damage because not only could you attack refine it, but it had Dagger 7, meaning that you were scaling more attack off the foe's debuffs. And it's something that Matthew would also run if you really wanted him to deal damage. But I think the biggest slap in the face for this in particular is that Matthew also had no base attack and still really doesn't. So you could run this weapon on an infantry unit with much higher attack and they would be doing much more stuff in the process. And in a similar fashion, but I don't think as drastic, we had Dark Royal Lance from Barkut, Weighted Lance from Gwendolyn, and the Wanderer's Blade from Rutger, Flowing Lance, Spirited Spear, and Arcane Devour respectively. These were all weapons that function in a similar fashion, but arguably maybe a bit weaker. Arcane Devour you could definitely argue in a different sense because it does offer no follow-up, but no follow-up is also extremely easy to give out, and Wanderer's Blade does grant extra attack and speed. That being said, they were all similar enough in a way to where you didn't ever really run one of these units over the specific inheritable, especially with Arcane Devour nowadays, because Rutger by himself isn't even a bad unit. His weapon is incredibly good because it is just a pure F Arcane Devour. The problem is that he's just a really old unit, so you could just grab any new unit that you really want, give them the weapon, and it takes less investment in time for stuff to get going. And while I wouldn't say that was the same thing with Barkut and Gwendolyn, it still was telling enough because you could still run these inheritable weapons that were also relatively easy to get, and it made it so you didn't really have any reason to build either of these units over just getting the weapon and giving it to a different unit you like. That being said, you couldn't go any worse than Blazing Durandal. Yeah, that was a thing at the time, and I think that's still a very wide held opinion to this day that Eliwood is just better Brave Roy, which you could definitely argue nowadays because the weapon is incredibly outdated at this point, especially now that Arcane Devour is a thing. But at the time, Eliwood being a demote with better res and access to a Resplendent overall made him a much more appealing choice because he was also incredibly easy to merge up. And while I wouldn't say Roy was bad because of it, it just made no sense to really invest into Roy when you had Eliwood. And I think that was probably the biggest case of that. Every other scenario was like, yeah, that sucks, but you know, at least this unit's accessible and you could build them up and that's nice. Not with Brave Roy. I'm sure there's plenty of other examples like that, but I can tell you right now there's over 1,000 units in this game and a load of skills, and if there is something I miss, it's probably because there's just way too much in the game. But you'll have to let me know if I did miss anything because I'm pretty sure these were some of the more egregious examples that we had. So just build who you like. That's always the fun of the game.